I'm 78 years old, and at this age you finally understand why the book of Proverbs isn't just a collection of religious sayings. It is the most compressed, field-tested manual of human nature ever written. Most people treat Proverbs like fortune cookies. They read one, nod politely, maybe post it on a wall. They think a proverb is a nice thought, a gentle reminder, something to embroider on a pillow, and that is the first misunderstanding because a proverb is none of those things. A proverb is a warning flare. A proverb is a map drawn by people who already walked into the trap you're about to walk into, who survived it, and came back specifically to warn you. The reason this literature is called wisdom and not knowledge isn't a matter of vocabulary. It's a distinction about the nature of the content itself. And most people never stop to think about that distinction. Knowledge can be transferred. You can give someone a fact they didn't have before, and now they have it. Wisdom cannot be transferred the same way. Wisdom has to be earned. It has to pass through experience, through the body, through the specific texture of failure and recovery and consequence. The proverb plants a seed. The living of your life is the soil, and at some point, if you've been paying attention, the seed and the soil finally meet. And suddenly, you don't just know what the proverb says, you know what it means. You feel it land somewhere deep, somewhere factual. You recognize it operating in other people's lives before they do. Not because you're more intelligent, but because you have already been there. That is the mechanism of Proverbs. That is why the same verse you read at 20 means something completely different at 50. The words did not change. You did. The proverb was already true. You just weren't seasoned enough yet to receive it. Take the most quoted line in all of Proverbs. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Everyone has heard it. Almost no one understands what it is actually pointing to. Because, on the surface, it sounds like a moral warning. Don't be arrogant, don't think too highly of yourself. And that reading isn't wrong, but it is shallow. What the writers were observing with surgical precision was a psychological sequence. Pride, in the ancient understanding, was not about self-confidence. It was about a specific and dangerous form of blindness. The blindness that comes from believing your model of reality is complete. And when a person becomes prideful in this sense, they stop receiving new information. They become uncorrectable. They have already decided what they know and who they are, and so the world can no longer update them. And the destruction that follows isn't divine punishment. It is simply the natural result of a person navigating a complex, continuously changing world with a frozen map. You walk into walls you cannot see because you stop believing that walls could appear in new places. And here's what most people miss. The ancient writers weren't describing individuals only. They were describing a pattern that recurs at every scale, in families, in organizations, in nations. When any system, human or institutional, becomes convinced of its own sufficiency, it stops processing feedback. It begins interpreting warning signals as threats to its identity rather than gifts of corrective information. And then it breaks, not because of the enemy outside, but because of the sealed window inside. Proverbs captured this thousands of years before systems theory existed. Before organizational psychology had a vocabulary for it. Someone had already watched this pattern repeat itself enough times, across enough generations, that they could distill it into a single sentence sharp enough to cut through any century. But it goes even deeper than that, because the writers of Proverbs weren't philosophers constructing elegant theories and towers. They were observers, ruthless, patient, longitudinal observers of what actually happens to people over time. The entire architecture of Proverbs is built on observation, not of what people believe or intend, but of what outcomes follow what behaviors consistently across generations. That's why it reads the way it does. Not, you should be honest because honesty is a virtue, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment, because they had watched over and over what actually happens to liars across a lifetime. The wisdom isn't ethical prescription, it's empirical description. And those are completely different things. One you can argue with, the other you have to reckon with. This is why Proverbs returns to the same themes repeatedly. Money, speech, relationships, work, temptation, counsel. Because these are precisely the domains where human beings most consistently and predictably destroy themselves, and where the patterns are most clearly observable over time. It is not a random collection, it is a curriculum. And the curriculum is organized around a single underlying question that almost no one asks explicitly. What does it actually cost to live a certain way? Not what it costs in terms of your eternal soul, not what it costs in public reputation, what it costs in the texture of your actual daily life, in your capacity to sleep at night, in the quality of your relationships, in the slow and silent accumulation of consequences that nobody sees coming because nobody was trained to watch the early signals. Take what Proverbs teaches about speech. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Most readers hear that as poetic exaggeration. It is not. It is one of the most precise clinical observations in the entire text, because what we now understand from decades of psychology and neuroscience is that the words we habitually use don't simply describe our reality. They actively construct it. The way you narrate your own life to yourself and to others is the architecture of the life you will actually inhabit. A person who has trained themselves to speak consistently in the language of victimhood is not merely describing their circumstances. They are continuously rebuilding a world in which agency is impossible, in which effort is futile, in which other people and outside forces are always the explanation for their position. A person who speaks with precision, with accountability, with what ancient writers would have called integrity of tongue, that person is literally building different neural pathways, different expectations, different relational realities. The tongue doesn't just communicate, it creates. Proverbs compressed that truth into 6 words. And then there's what Proverbs says about counsel, which is where it becomes almost unsettlingly contemporary. In the abundance of counselors there is safety, not in the abundance of intelligence, not in the abundance of resources or talent or determination. Counselors. People who will tell you what you do not want to hear and what you did not ask to be told. This is the insight that the most genuinely successful people in every era keep rediscovering, and that the most catastrophically failed people, regardless of how brilliant they were, keep ignoring until it is too late. The human mind is extraordinarily bad at stress testing its own conclusions, not because we are unintelligent, but because our cognition is motivated. We are biologically wired to find evidence that we are right, to dismiss evidence that we are wrong, and to feel most certain and most confident at precisely the moments when we should be most cautious and most open. The only partial antidote to this design flaw is deliberate exposure to external perspective. Specifically, perspective from people who have nothing to gain from agreeing with you. Proverbs knew this 3,000 years ago. We keep relearning it at enormous cost. The real power in this is understanding what Proverbs is ultimately teaching beneath all the specific instruction about money and marriage and diligence and integrity. It is teaching a philosophy of how reality is actually structured. It is saying, the universe has a grain. There are real and durable patterns in the way human choices connect to human outcomes, and these patterns are not arbitrary, and they are not infinitely negotiable, and they do not make exceptions for good intentions. You can ignore them. You can construct sophisticated arguments for why they don't apply to your particular situation, but they persist regardless. The person who will not work consistently will eventually face want, not as cosmic retribution, but as the straightforward mechanics of how resources are generated and depleted over time. The person who cultivates dishonesty in their dealings will find their relationships progressively hollowing out, one by one, because trust is the infrastructure of genuine connection, and infrastructure deteriorates without maintenance. The person who cannot govern their own temper will find their options steadily narrowing, because people who have alternatives choose not to build their lives around unpredictable explosions. These are not moral fairy tales. They are engineering observations about how human social architecture actually functions. And the reason Proverbs is still being read, studied, argued over, and returned to after 3,000 years, while the vast majority of ancient texts are dust and footnotes, is that the architecture it describes has not changed. Human nature has not changed. The way trust operates has not changed. The way pride blinds and envy corrodes and disciplined effort compounds, none of that has changed. The technology changes, the vocabulary changes, the clothing changes. The underlying structure of what happens to people based on how they consistently choose to live, that stays. It has always stayed. Here's what most people miss about why Proverbs carries a different weight than other ancient wisdom. It was never trying to teach you how to be good. It was trying to teach you how reality works. That reorientation changes everything about how you read it. When Solomon writes about the sluggard, the person who refuses to work, who always has a reason why today is not the day, he is not issuing a moral condemnation. He is describing a trajectory. He is saying, watch this person over 20 years and I will show you exactly where they end up. And I have watched it. I have watched what disciplined, consistent effort does over 20 years, and I have watched what chronic avoidance does over 20 years, and I can tell you that Proverbs is not exaggerating. It is, if anything, underreporting how stark the divergence becomes. The practical application, after all the depth, after all the layers, is this. Read Proverbs the way a pilot reads instruments, not for inspiration, not for comfort, for calibration, to know where you actually are versus where you believe you are. When a proverb produces resistance in you, when you read it and feel a flicker of irritation or a desire to explain why it doesn't quite apply here, that is the one to slow down with. The resistance is almost always the sound of your current self-justification encountering an older and harder truth. The proverb that irritates you is the proverb that is working on you, and the one that seems obvious, the one you read quickly and think, yes, of course, everyone understands that. That is the one you should read most slowly. Because the distance between knowing a principle and actually living by it is the exact distance between information and wisdom. And that distance, my friend, is crossed only one way. It is crossed through time, through choices, through consequences, through the slow, humbling education of a life actually lived. That is why they are called wisdom. Not because someone wrote them down, because someone lived long enough to know they were true. And here is what I want to leave you with. The thing that takes the longest to truly absorb. Proverbs is not a book you finish. It is a book that finishes you, slowly, over lifetime. You return to it at 30 and it teaches you one thing. You return at 45 and it teaches you something else from the exact same sentence. You return at 60 and realize the verse you thought you understood at 30, you had only barely touched. The text doesn't deepen, you deepen. And the proverb is always there, waiting patiently at whatever depth you finally manage to reach, ready to hand you the next layer. That is the design. That is why wisdom literature is structured the way it is. Dense, compressed, seemingly simple on the surface. Because it was written for rereading. It was written for the person you will be in 10 years, not just the person you are today. Every proverb is a time-released teaching, and you don't get the full release until you've lived enough to need it. At 78, looking back across the whole of a life, what becomes undeniable is that the patterns Proverbs describes are not occasional. They are constant. They operate in every era, in every culture, in every economic condition. The humble person who can receive correction keeps growing. The proud person who cannot be taught stops growing, regardless of their intelligence or their advantages. The person who guards their words carefully builds something durable over decades. The person who speaks carelessly, who uses words as weapons or as shields or as tools of impression management, steadily erodes the very relationships they were trying to protect or impress. These are not beliefs, they are observations. And at some point, the observations accumulate into something that can only be called wisdom. Not because you're wise, because you finally stopped arguing with what you've seen. That is why, at this age, you see it. Not because age automatically confers wisdom. It doesn't. Plenty of people grow old and learn nothing. But if you have been paying attention, if you have had the particular grace to be correctable, to look honestly at what your choices actually produced, rather than what you intended them to produce, then at some point the book of Proverbs stops being a religious text and starts being something closer to a mirror. And what you see in it is not a set of rules. You see a record of human patterns, witnessed and recorded with unflinching honesty, offered forward across millennia to anyone willing to slow down enough to actually receive them. The wisdom was always there. The question was only ever whether you were ready.